Configuring VM monitoring in Hyper-V 2016. If we go to Failover Clustering Manager, right, or Failover Cluster Manager, as you can see, I have a cluster called Hypercluster 1, and inside this Hypercluster 1, I have three hosts. Host means server running Hyper-V hypervisor. So I have three hosts, Hyper 1, Hyper 2, Hyper 3, and I have four guest VM. Guest means a virtual machine which is running on hypervisor. So I have four guest VMs or virtual machines running on these three hypervisors or three hosts. Now, we know that the failover clustering will take care of the entire VM itself. That's fine. For example, server 1 is running on Hyper 1. If Hyper 1 fails, server 2 will be restarted either on Hyper 2 or Hyper 3. That will be taken care by Failover Cluster Manager. But what about if any service failed within the VM or within server 1? Suppose server 1 is a print server and all my users uh, they print from this server 1, right? What if the print spooler service stops? Well, you can configure VM monitoring in Failover Cluster Manager so that if a service failed 3 times, Failover Cluster Manager can automatically restart that guest VM on another hypervisor host. Means, suppose if the print spooler service failed once, it will try to restart the service itself. If it fails twice again, it will start the service or try to start the service. If the print spooler service failed third time within that specified period, which depends on the cluster settings, the Hyper-V or failover cluster manager will restart the entire VM and fail it over to other hosts. Means the server 1 will be restarted and it will go to either Hyper 2 or Hyper 3. This is good. And how to configure it? There are some specific requirement. Number one, of course, before well, yeah, I just remember one thing. Before we talk about requirements, how Hyper-V knows about the services which are running inside this guest VM? Well, this information is provided by integrated integrated services, right? For example, if you see server one, right, and if I go inside server one, you know that when we install a virtual machine, a guest virtual machine on a Hyper-V server or Hyper-V host, it automatically installs integration services, right? These integration services provide information from within the VM to the hypervisor. So that's why Hyper-V knows about services which are running inside the VM. For example, in VMware vSphere, VMware tools do the same job. They provide heartbeat to ESXi server and they provide status and they allow you to configure VM monitoring. So in vSphere, we have VMware tools. In Hyper-V, we have integration services, right? So, for example, okay, once we have this, um, What other requirements? The other requirements are very simple. The machine that you want to configure for VM monitoring needs to be in the same domain, or at least the domain which has trust relationship. If Windows Firewall is enabled, make sure you have exception for VM monitoring and those required protocols, which I will show you in a minute. Another option or the another requirement is the subsequent retry option of a service should be set to no action, which I believe most of the services it's already set to no action. For example, now let me show you everything. Let's take example of server one, right? Server one, if I go inside server one, we can see it's a member of a domain, itsense.com, same domain as my Hyper-V server or failover cluster, so that's no problem. Windows Firewall is on, however, we have some exceptions. What I did, I add some exceptions for it. And what are those exceptions for inbound rule? So if I just show you, I add exception for virtual machine monitoring decom, virtual machine monitoring echo request, virtual machine monitoring echo request. Yeah, one for version 4 and one for version 6, and virtual machine monitoring for NetBIOS session in and virtual machine monitoring for RPC. You can use either GUI or you can use a PowerShell command, which is this setnet firewall rule space display name virtual machine monitoring space enabled true. So whatever virtual machine monitoring is, whether it's echo request or NB session is or RPC, wherever the display name is virtual machine monitoring, it will allow those things. One thing I also noticed that along with this, as you can see, this is virtual machine monitoring echo request, right? So it's better to enable echo request as well as NB session in RPC and decom. So once you enable these things and you need to check for the service that you want to configure for VM monitoring, for example, in my case, print spooler, and make sure if you go to the properties of the service, under recovery action, the third option, which is subsequent failures, set to take no action. As you can see, first failure, restart the service. Second failure, restart the service. Subsequent failure, take no action. Because when this machine is in Hyper-V failover cluster, first failure, it will take this action which is configured inside the VM, which is restart the service. Second failure, again, it will restart the service. Third failure, what it will do, it will restart the VM itself. Okay. Now, once you fulfill all the requirements, then how to configure VM monitoring? For that, you need to go to Failover Cluster Manager, Roles, select the VM for which you want to configure VM monitoring, right-click, Mode Actions, Configure Monitoring. And then as you can see, it will show you the service or services which are running, which are available, which are there inside VM. Maybe stopped and their status could be there, it could be stopped or running, right? So it depends. And how, again, how hypervisor or Hyper-V pull this information from the VM with the help of integration services. Okay, so as I said, I want to configure VM monitoring from print spooler. I will select for print spooler, which is currently running, and click OK. And that's it. That's how simple is to configure VM monitoring. The only thing you need to do is to do the homework, which is not a big deal. Usually your VMs will be a part of your domain, right? As far as firewall exceptions is concerned, if you are disabling the firewall altogether, then no need for firewall rule exceptions. But if you like to keep in your environment, if you like to keep your firewall enabled for domain profile, then make sure there are exceptions for virtual machine monitoring. And those services, like for example, file and print services and ICMP, as well as NetBIOS. And the third thing is the subsequent action, subsequent recovery action under the recovery tab of service, which is by default set to take no action. The third action is, which is a subsequent failure, which is for subsequent failure by default is set to take no action. But again, just make sure. Once it's there, all you have to do just configure or enable the VM monitoring. And that's it. Hyper-V will automatically take care of the service. So when it will fail third time, Hyper-V will restart this VM. One more thing, although it's not directly related to VM monitoring, but I would like to show you that. Like if I go to server one and say manage, it will launch in Hyper-V Manager on Hyper one because server one is running there, right? So if I go right click and settings, right, I end up on this settings for server 1 VM, and under network adapters, advanced features, there is one option called protected network. If this option is selected, right, what will happen? Let's, if the VM face network disconnection, Hyper-V will live migrate this VM to another host. So for example, currently this VM server 1 is running on Hyper 1, and for some reason, let's say this VM server 1 face or network disconnection. Once it happens, Hyper-V or Failover Cluster Manager will live migrate this VM from Hyper 1 to Hyper 2 or Hyper 3. Depends which host is the best candidate for running this VM. If you don't want this, then all you have to do is just disable or deselect this checkbox. So in this case, even the network disconnection happens, the VM will not be live migrated to another host. This can also be accessed through right-clicking the server one, and instead of manage, you can go to settings, and it's the same thing. Network adapter, advanced settings, protected network. As it says, move this virtual machine to another cluster node if a network disconnection is detected. Right? So these are the few things or few options which are related to VM monitoring. And Hyper-V and Failover Cluster Manager, when you create Failover cluster for Hyper-V nodes, they provide you these options built in, like load balancing as well as VM monitoring. So you can better utilize these features and manage your Hyper-V environment effectively. Again, we are not talking about virtual machine manager yet or system center virtual machine manager. As you know, system center virtual machine manager or SCVMM, it's like a vCenter in vSphere. As you can see right now, we don't have any centralized interface. But without System Center Virtual Machine Manager, we have so many other options. We can do live migration. We can configure high availability because basically when we configure failover cluster, we configure high availability, right? So high availability for VM is already configured as they are part of failover cluster. We can use live migration and we can use load balancing and VM monitoring, all of these features without having System Center Virtual Machine Manager. So this is great. One more option that I would like to mention here is the startup priority. By default, all VM startup priority is medium, means if this server one failover to another host, let's say server one is running to Hyper one and Hyper V fails. Server one needs to be what will happen because these machines are highly available. These VMs will be restarted, right? Then what will be the restart priority? There are three priorities: high, medium, low, and no auto start. If I set the priority to high, the VMs with startup priority high will be starting first. For example, I have some domain controllers running as a virtual machine. I will set their priority to high. So in case when there is let's say an incident and virtual machine needs to be restarted, I want my domain controller to be started first. And if they are DHCP server, and usually domain controllers are DNS servers, and in some cases, we use them as DHCP server as well. But DHCP server could be different. Then second, I may like to enable DHCP server. Or there are some VMs which are test and development. I'm not too much worried about it. I can set their priority to low. So they will be last to start. So high priority VMs will be started first, then medium priority VM will be started, and then the low priority VM will be started. And if there are some VMs that you don't want them to Hyper-V to auto start, you can select this option as well, which is no auto start. So when in case of a failure or this server or this VM server 4 will not be automatically restarted. We will do it manually. So you can set the priorities, start low, medium, and high. Of course, critical servers you will configure with high priority, servers that you want to start first, then medium, and then low. So this is it, guys. This is about VM monitoring and priorities. And I'll see you in another video. Please don't forget to subscribe and like and share as much as you can. Take it easy.